Jay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our EDO appreciation presentation. My name is Jay Garner, and I am serving as chair of the Guild for this year. It's a crazy time for all of us, but with adversity comes opportunity. We salute you knowing that you're on the front lines of helping to build your area's economy. Post-COVID, there will be opportunity, and we want to help you in any way we can by providing content that may be helpful to you moving forward. Unfortunately, we can't provide small business loans or grants. We can't serve as a conduit for PPP loans, but we can share with you our perspectives from our knowledge with our corporate clients. The Guild is 10 years young this year, and we've had a few thousand EDO professionals attend one or more of our events since our founding. Today's presentation is our way to say thank you for what you do and your support of our efforts. I'm going to turn it over to our President and CEO, Rick Weddle, who will serve as today's moderator.
Thank you, Jay. I'm Rick Weddle, President and CEO of the Site Selectors Guild. Before we begin, let me pause just for a moment to say thanks to each one of you for joining us today. We know there's a lot going on in your world with the pandemic and also with the more recent protests across the country, and we want to thank you for taking the time to join with us and be a part of this webinar today. Today, I'm pleased to serve as moderator of this webinar. As you know, the Guild is the premier location advisory organization representing the world's top site location professionals. In the past 3 years alone, Guild members have facilitated the creation of over 165,000 new jobs and more than 90 billion in announced capital investment. Next slide. Today's webinar will focus on a number of topics. It's entitled Doing Deals in the COVID-19 Environment, a topic of interest to both EDOs and site selectors alike. First, Jay Garner with Garner Economics will present a summary of our recent COVID-19 Guild member survey. Dee Dee Caldwell with Global Location Strategies will discuss site visits during the new normal. Greg Burkhart with Duff & Phelps will dig into new opportunities and about a realigned global supply chain. Larry Gigerich with Genovis will talk about policies and programs, and yes, of course, incentives needed to win new projects. Finally, in the time we have left, I will moderate questions and answers with our panelists. We have today over 500 partners registered for this complimentary webinar. As Jay said at the beginning, the Guild is presenting this webinar to you in appreciation for your support, your participation, and engagement in our conferences and events in the past. Before we get started, I want to note that the registration for the 2020 Fall Forum in Richmond, Virginia will begin on Monday, June 15th at noon Central Time. You'll want to mark that date and time on your calendar and make plans to register and join us this September 21st through the 23rd in Richmond, Virginia. Also, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping notes. If you look about halfway down your webinar control panel, you'll see the questions block. During the webinar, feel free to type in and submit questions on the presentation topics. I'll be reviewing those questions and selecting them to present to our speakers during the Q&A session. Additionally, we're recording today's webinar, and that recording, along with a slide deck, will be available on our website, siteselectorsguild.com, by midday tomorrow. So let's get started as I hand it back to Jay Garner for a summary of our recent member survey. Jay?
Thank you, Rick. Again, my pleasure to present some of the research that our partners, DCI and the Guild, undertook in very early April. And I want to emphasize that this data that we're presenting was done in early April, and we are actually moving now at the speed of sound with businesses reopening. We will update this information at the end of June and offered our updated research at that time, but we're already seeing some changes. So I'm going to move through this expeditiously so that we can get to the other panelists. So next slide. This survey that was done again at the end of, at the beginning of April, we received feedback from all 50 of our members. And one of our members made a very good point. You know, we are all in a relationship business, which is the reason why we enjoy meeting with you at Guild events, when we like doing field work in your respective regions, your states, your communities, your countries, so that we can create that relationship. One of our members said, using the word social distance is really not what we want to see. We all know that there is a requirement for physical distancing, but the point of this is that we want to maintain those relationships, those interpersonal relationships that we have with each of you during this time. Next slide. We're all busy. We all want to stay in touch with what we're doing, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation today, and we continue to look forward to hearing from you. I think that our EDO friends, all of you who are on this call today, this webinar, I think have done an incredible job reaching out to our membership about what's going on in your respective communities to keep us engaged and informed. Next slide. Now here's one of the slides that I think that we're going to see a significant shift when we update this with our membership at the end of June. So when we did this in April, 52% of our members said that companies are pausing projects, and 45% said that they are moving forward. I think that this will get, from what we are hearing anecdotally or in real time, because I'm seeing more RFPs now from companies. I know our panelists are also seeing the same. I think this number is going to be reversed, and we're starting to see actually more projects moving forward now since the month of April, when it was basically a complete pause in the global economy. Next slide. So we asked our members at that time when we thought activity would return, of which 55% thought the fourth quarter of this year and 45% in the first quarter or sometime in 2021. I'm anxious to see how this will show when we update it. Next slide. What are some of the hot activities? Well, I think we all know that those within the life science related to pharmaceutical, medical supplies, medical equipment, and of course, distribution and logistics to protect the supply chain are all active projects right now, as well as food and beverage. And we're starting to see a lot of that, as this slide shows. Next slide. Then we wanted to see what functions, and obviously a lot in the distribution side. Amazon has had some announcements since the pandemic. We're seeing activity. I'm seeing RFPs on the manufacturing side, especially in the food and beverage. And so it complements and validates what our membership saw back in early April, when a lot of this was just educated guesses. Next slide. So what were some of the recommended priorities for all of you as economic development professionals on a scale of 1 to 5? Well, almost everyone said that to help save what you can with your small businesses and other companies as a whole, focus on business retention. Others consisted of those that were in workforce development initiatives or to update your targeted industries. So you see a lot of activity, a lot of thought on what you should be doing as economic development professionals. Next slide. What do we want to hear from you? I think you've done a fantastic job with that, with your social media posts, with webinars you've conducted, with virtual fan visits that I've seen from economic development regional groups, and that's, again, updates on your market conditions, what you're doing with new approaches as it relates to during and really a post-COVID environment. Update on incentives, and Larry is going to talk about incentives later. Your sites and buildings, which is what Dee Dee is going to talk about. And then, of course, your labor force. You know, we're not really now in a people shortage, but we're still in a skill shortage. That hasn't gone away. So what you're doing to enhance the skills of your populace is a key component. Next slide. So how about the supply chain? What do we need to do to protect the supply chain and our global distribution as a result of what we all experienced in the month of April? Most of our members felt that there would be an emphasis, a pivot on supply chain strategies. I firmly believe that. Many of our members do. And you can see that the average on that, the mean is 4.3. Next slide. Now, it's much easier said than done than to say that we want to bring over some of those third-party or direct company relationships that are in China. But we're also thinking that a lot of these companies might have an Asia +1 or a China +1 environment as it relates to the supply chain. Next slide. Then what about working from home? So next slide. So how is this going to affect the long term? About four on a scale of 5. The mean 4.0 believes that there will be a long-term impact of current remote work. I think this might change significantly too as a result of the survey that we do at the end of June. For example, Google has said that their campus out in California will remain basically closed in 2021. I'm in Atlanta. A lot of places in Atlanta are back to work. A lot of major offices are going back to work following CDC and their own social distancing policies. So this is going to be an interesting one to see in the next time we do a survey and thereafter. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dee Dee Caldwell, who's going to be talking about our site visits and the new normal. Hey, Dee Dee, you are on mute.
Yes, bingo. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. You know, Jay or Rick said this is a relationship business, and I just want to give a shout out because last night I came up to visit my mom in beautiful Brevard, North Carolina, and although the view from her porch is quite stunning, the Wi-Fi is a bit iffy. So I texted Josh Hollingsey here at the Transylvania Economic Alliance, and he was very quick to reply that they could set me up in their conference room. So big shout out to Transylvania Economic Alliance. I want to talk to you today, we can go to the next slide, about site visits in the new normal. And I'm going to break this up into two pieces. So the first part is about the virtual site visits, which have become an integral part of the site selection process. They had already started to become a part, but with COVID-19, it has definitely become a key issue that we're having to deal with. So GLS was kind of a pioneer in this area. We started using virtual site visits back in 2012. And the reason that we did it is because we found that using a virtual site visit in place of, or sometimes complementary to, the consultant visit to the community, we were able to go through the site selection process a lot faster and be much more cost efficient. And as schedules started to compress, we were seeing that our clients responded to that. There were a few unintended, or I should say unanticipated, benefits associated with that. One was that we were able to include more sites and communities farther into the process, so that instead of arbitrarily drawing that line at, say, 6 or 7 sites, we could extend that to 8 or 10 or maybe even 12 sites and do a virtual site visit. The second thing is that we found that sometimes our clients wanted to participate in these virtual site tours, and I would say, and they participate now at about 80 or 90%. Some of them are completely passive. They don't engage. They're just listening and watching what's going on. Some of them are active participants, and some of them actually like to lead the virtual site visit. The benefit of this is it gets their input into your community and into your site much earlier in the process. But it also means the stakes are higher for you as a community, because when you're conducting these virtual site visits, the client is actually on the line. It's not just me, and there might be some things that I would be a little bit more flexible on dealing with, like technology problems, or maybe you don't have all of your stakeholders completely aligned. We might be able to say, well, you know, we can work through that. Clients sometimes are not so forgiving, and so you need to be really well practiced in doing this. But ultimately, we found that we can achieve about 80% of our goals as we do in in-person visits. There's still nothing that replaces getting on the ground and doing the site visits face-to-face, but this is a really good way to move quickly through that first part of the diligence process and get to our preferred sites. So next slide. So what is a virtual site visit? So essentially that is using some kind of a technology platform to be able to communicate to the client or to the consultant everything that you need to communicate about your community, the site itself, your workforce, the utilities, the logistics infrastructure. We often talk about costs, we talk about incentives. So it's essentially everything that we would like to do on the ground, but we're doing it in a virtual manner. Depending on the complexity of the project, these can last anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. So it's a marathon, yes. And typically what we do is we structure it so that there are times that you can bring in the utilities, times that you bring in the logistics folks, so that everybody doesn't have to sit through all of those meetings. And the beauty is that they can do it just like we're doing it now. They don't all have to come to one location at one time. They can go right from their home or from their office or wherever they are. The link down in the corner is a video that we just recently produced for GLS that talks a little bit more about virtual site visits if you want to know a little bit more about our approach to them. Next slide. So I'm going to give you 4 rules. Forgive the Clemson reference, but you know, 4 rules to have a successful site visit. So the first one is that you want to have a game plan. And in having a game plan, you want to assign a quarterback, somebody that is going to help you to victory, like Trevor Lawrence, and that can coordinate the whole thing and make sure that all of the stakeholders are aligned. Nothing can derail a site visit or a virtual site tour the way having somebody step up and say, well, we're not really sure that we are committed to providing that much water, for example. So you want to make sure that you get all of that out of the way before you actually get onto the virtual site tour. Next slide. So rule number two is to think like the client. So any Star Trek fans out there, the old mind meld, so you really want to try to get into the head of the client, and you can anticipate their questions by looking at the RFP. One of the things I would encourage you to do is to look at the big $3 items, which are typically some combination of logistics, labor, and energy. Depending on the client, there may be other issues. I mean, maybe water is more of an issue. Typically, water for us is more of a qualitative issue and has less impact on cost, but logistics, labor, and energy are the big 3. So if you just on the back of an envelope multiply what the number of workers they're going to have times the labor rate, the number of megawatts of power they're going to be using times your electric rate, do the same thing for gas. If you know anything about their product, you can start thinking about how you're positioned from logistics, and then you can see where their big cost factors are. And those are going to be the things that they're likely focused on from a cost standpoint. The other thing you want to think about is, what are their risks? If they say that they need 25 megawatts of power by a certain date, what is the confidence that you can give them to deliver that on time, on budget? And then also, what is going to be the risk for them to be able to operate, start up, commission their facility, and operate now into the future? So these are location-dependent risks. If you just think ahead of time about what questions and what issues they're going to have associated with your community, then you can be better prepared to answer those questions. Next slide. So tell your story, but tell your story in a way that's meaningful to them. So a little bit is getting into the mind of the client, but the other thing is to assume you're probably not going to know who the client is. So let's just assume that they landed here from Mars, and you need to give them a picture, starting big and going down to the regional and community level, of where you're located, what are your key advantages of your location. You want to make sure that you follow that agenda, and you want to move from topic to topic in a very seamless way, but always keeping in mind that, you know, this is your story to tell, and you have this one opportunity to tell them why they should be in your community and nowhere else. I would encourage you to include also a little bit, 5 minutes or so, on quality of life, just so that they have a flavor of what it would be like to live in your community. Next slide. And the last one is be a tech pro. So there's only about 15,000 virtual platforms out there that you need to get to know. I've mastered about 14,990. It's the last 10 that are still stumping me. So make sure you understand what tech platform you're going to be using beforehand. If it's something that, if they're allowing you to choose, that's fine. But if it's something that they're going to use, just make sure that you get in and practice with anybody that's calling in. Make sure they know how to hit the mute button, like me. I had to remember to turn it back on. You don't want that feedback. One of the things I would encourage you to do is to not show videos. The problem with that is that the video is buffering on your end, and then it's transmitting, and sometimes that really just doesn't work. So if you want to show a video, make sure you send the link ahead of time. The other thing is geospatial platforms like Google Earth or Esri products can really help communicate your site and your community by showing multiple layers, by having street view. All of those are very, very instrumental in helping to show the different factors and how they, geophysical and community type attributes that influence the competitiveness of your site. And then the other thing is, drones and virtual reality, augmented reality. I mean, I definitely think that those are great tools, and any site that you have that is of a significant size should definitely have drone video, whether we're doing virtual site visits or in site visits in real life. But just make sure that you, I'm really excited to see what type of technology is going to come out of this. I think that the technology is going to make big leaps and bounds as a result of what we're dealing with now with COVID. Next slide. So eventually we're going to get to site visits in real life. And I think for the time being, at least until we have a vaccine, you want to be prepared to accommodate the new normal. And that means, I was talking with someone the other day, and they had site visits where they visited 10 sites in this one community. It was a region, 10 sites in 3 days, and they had 8 cars and 1 person in each car. So think about how you're going to accommodate that. How are you going to communicate between those cars? Where are you going to do your meetings? You might want to use, instead of using regular meeting rooms, you might want to use like council chambers or small auditoriums so that you can space people apart. Also think about how you're going to serve meals, because as we all know, the eating is very much part of the site visit experience. So obviously no buffets, but what are other ways that you can make people feel comfortable in that type of environment until we get to the point where we can go back to more of our day-to-day expectations. Next slide. One of the things I'd like for you to think about is that you probably have some funds that were sitting there for travel, going to conferences and that sort of thing that you are not able to use. I'm a little bit concerned about what happens with economic development budgets next year. But while you've got some of this extra sitting there, I would look at how you can reallocate those to make these virtual site visits and ultimately the new normal of site visits more effective. So investing in enhanced geospatial capabilities, doing your drone videos, communication devices for multiple vehicles, really good walkie-talkies. And then the other thing that I think is kind of clever is to create some custom logo face masks for your client, so that they've got something that's useful that they can take away with them. Next slide. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Larry Gigerich, and he's going to talk about the opportunities in a realigned global supply chain. Oh, sorry, not Larry, Greg Burkhart. Sorry.
Thanks, Dee.
The other Larry.
The other Larry. The other Larry is actually better looking. Well, thanks, Dee. Next slide. Let's just jump right into the slides. So today we wanted to spend a few minutes sharing our thoughts on the macro trends affecting offshoring opportunities and reshoring opportunities, and particularly the reshoring of those goods that are produced in China. You know, in the old days, cost was king, and a lot of U.S. companies moved manufacturing offshore based on the unit costs to produce. The biggest component 40 years ago, and still is probably one of the biggest components today, as mentioned by Dee, is labor. And so in 1980, as you see in the chart on the screen there, in 1980, U.S. wages were about 32 times the level that they were in China. Well, fast forward 4 decades, and the Chinese wages have risen about 2,000% over that time period, while the U.S. wages have risen about 190%. So what that means is the wage differential between China and the United States has shrunk dramatically. And today it's now 4x. So what that means is a $4 an hour wage in China is a $16 an hour wage in the United States. Well, as those labor costs started rising in China, and they were primarily rising along the coastal communities where a lot of U.S. manufacturers set up operations initially. What ended up happening is those labor costs rose. Those companies started moving to the interior provinces. And as they moved to the interior provinces, then logistics costs increased rather dramatically as well. So we see in China today, the overall cost equation has changed dramatically in the last 40 years. Next slide. So many of you may remember the tipping point industries, the analysis that was done by the Boston Consulting Group almost a decade ago. I think it was 2012 when they did their original analysis. And their theory at the time was that as labor and logistics costs rose in China, then companies would be more motivated to reshore production back to the U.S. The problem with that theory was that China's consumer economy developed rapidly and just sort of morphed into this absolute behemoth. And so what happened then is U.S. manufacturers continued to produce in China because, and then ship the products back to the United States, but they continued to produce in China because the marginal cost to produce extra goods and then ship back to the U.S. was very low. So they could maintain their operations there. And so there really wasn't this big reshoring based on cost that was predicted back in 2012. Next slide. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been spending a lot of time with clients, and we developed our own reshoring index. And what we see today is that, you know, costs are no longer king. With all the geopolitical events and with COVID and everything that's happening in the world, companies are starting to include much more than cost in their overall equations. And what we're really seeing is risks are starting to be factored into their thinking more so than ever before. So what we did is we took the initial cost index, and that's in the first column that you see there and from the previous slides. But then we also factored in other strategic elements. You know, for example, IP protection, worker safety, product quality. And the biggest one today that we're hearing a lot about recently is national security. And, you know, to help us kind of quantify the national security element of the index, what we did is we looked at Homeland Security's list of published essential infrastructure industries. And there's a number of industries that are on that list. You know, some of the top ones are communications equipment, anything relating to the U.S. defense industrial base, energy, food and ag products, information tech, and I think we had mentioned early on healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So when we factor in those additional 4 elements, we see that there's the ones that we have here in the green are the industries that we see as being primed for coming back to the United States. And you see there's actually only probably out of all of these cost, with the exception of chemicals, cost is not the overriding element. What the overriding elements are here are particularly those risk issues. So we see, now the number one industry that's primed for reshoring, other transportation equipment. Second, navigational equipment. Third, basic chemicals. Actually, basic chemicals was on the list before from Boston Consulting Group, and it's still on that list. Number 4, semiconductors and other electronic components, medical equipment, communications equipment, aerospace, and auto parts. So these are the top 8 industries that we see as opportunities for companies that are looking to relocate back to the United States. Next slide. Today, if we were to overlay these strategic factors and start considering more than just costs, the new tipping point industries are the ones that we have highlighted here in yellow, where the overall benchmark score is yellow rather than green. As you see on this list, the new tipping point industries are electrical equipment, appliances, and components. The one that kind of surprised me, soap and cleaning products. But if you think about COVID, we want to make sure that we have access to our own cleaning products here in the United States. Machinery manufacturing, food, beverage, and tobacco products, pharmaceuticals and medicines, and primary metals. And so if you want to move the needle, and Larry's going to talk about this in a little bit, but if you want to move the needle on these industries that are in the tipping point, there's a couple policy considerations, that you may want to think about adopting or at least supporting. So, for example, at the federal level, we have some international organizations that recently the administration has withdrawn from, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They've defunded the World Health Organization. We might see more of this activity at the international level, again, retrenching our activity back here in the United States. The other thing is on the regulatory side, and we see, or what we're hearing more from the administration, are these transparency measures. So, all of these disclosures relating to made in the USA. So it's not just a finished product, but there's a movement afoot to actually take a look at content, raw materials, and having a disclosure for where those items are coming from as well. And then finally, we're seeing examples with incentives. If you take a look at what the Japanese have done here recently, trying to encourage some of their companies to move back from China, incentives are also another area to actually sort of tip the scales and to bring an industry back to the United States. So with that, I think that's a perfect time to segue to the other better looking Larry Giggich.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. And let me add my thanks to my fellow guild members and Rick as well for all the attendees participating today. We always enjoy sharing with you and getting your feedback and input on key issues. And maybe before I jump into my handful of slides here, before we move to Q&A, one thing I wanted to note, going through this COVID-19 situation that we all have for these past few months, obviously and appropriately so, we focus on healthcare workers and first responders as the ones that really had to step up and help us all get through this, as we've seen this impact not only here in the United States but throughout the world. But really, and as I've had more conversations with people about this, including some media folks, is to really position our economic development professionals as the next group of really first responders that are going to step up, meaning that obviously the economic impact we've seen of COVID-19, and the potential for us to go into, some form of a recession, maybe for 12 months or so, economic development and economic development professionals are going to be critically important to how we rebuild economies in our communities, regions, states, and countries around the world. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge all of your good work, but recognize, you're kind of that next line of defense as we move forward with our economy, and I wanted to thank you for that. So as I jump into my slides here, I wanted to talk about some different things, obviously related to incentives, and like most of my fellow guild members, we all enjoy consuming information, and it's a part of our business. So I've been reading a lot pieces that Brookings Institute and McKinsey have put out around COVID-19, the economic impact, and kind of how we move forward. So for purposes of this slide, I picked some work that Brookings had recently done regarding flattening the curve, but looking at it beyond just the pandemic, but the recession, and as a couple of panelists have referred to, the impact on budgets, governmental agencies and budgets, and what that means as well as we move forward. So, as I view it, policymakers should really be guided by three key principles. One, don't be bound by convention, meaning don't tie yourself to thinking about how things had been in the past, how we responded to things, but in particular, think about fast and coordinated steps that can be taken, and to make sure those policies are multidimensional and bold. And I would add to that, building in flexibility to be able to pivot. We may see, hopefully not, but we may see another wave of COVID-19 before we have a vaccine in place. So being nimble enough to respond to that is going to be critically important. Secondly, paying special attention to sequencing, and again, thinking about it in a way that is highly cognizant of fiscal and economic realities, and leaving as much space as possible for a possible next phase of the pandemic, but also just depending on how the economy moves forward, whether we go into a recession. So I think the key important item there is to understand that planning effectively, being nimble, being flexible, especially looking at the fiscal picture, is really important. And we're already seeing some of the places, in particular, if we look at states in the US that have planned well economically with their surplus and rainy day fund or other things that are in place, how they're much better positioned than some other places that maybe hadn't done that planning and don't have some of the flexibility. And then finally, distinguish between the terms of trade-offs, meaning, over the mid to long term, there's going to be health interventions, whether it's another round of COVID-19 or a different pandemic, and economic activity, and making sure that everything is being looked at through that prism as we go forward, because obviously health is critically important, but obviously making sure that we have an economy that works and doesn't cause other issues is really important. Next slide, please. So when you think about programs and kind of where we are, and in particular the economic fallout of COVID-19, and as I mentioned, decent chance we're going to see a recession, policymakers are going to, and I think Rick alluded to this earlier, look at, and the natural reaction, understandably, was to focus on existing businesses. How do we keep them? First, how do we stabilize them? And then secondly, how do we help them as they grow moving forward? But it's obviously very important for communities, regions, and states to also focus on how they attract new companies into their area. Perhaps it's a strategy to further diversify your economy, but obviously realizing too that you have assets you can leverage to attract new companies to your area that will help the economic stability both in the short and long term. Certainly, there's some key areas of focus in looking how you deploy dollars, and especially if there's more limited dollars available, maybe for in 2021 as we look forward, as Dee Dee mentioned, but looking at things like access to capital, job training, infrastructure, entrepreneurial development. Many of these areas we've seen communities, regions, and states invest in pretty consistently before COVID-19. But these areas will take on a really pronounced importance as we move forward. As I briefly touched on a moment ago, declining local and state tax revenues as we look out probably over this next year or so will be an issue, but obviously economic development incentives, as Greg mentioned, that can tip the scale, especially when you are down to a handful of finalist locations that look pretty similar on paper, and we all have confidence that our clients can be successful in. It's really important that we do not see economic development incentives in terms of dollar amounts available cut in this period where we really need to try to grow our economies, again, stabilize our existing businesses, but grow our economies going forward. It may involve kind of realigning priorities and where those dollars are dedicated, but it should almost be the area of last resort, cutting funding for economic development organizations and cutting incentive programs, because of what we need to do to support all of our collective economies. And then finally, with all of you and your organizations as professional economic developers, really implementing short and long-term strategies to be successful. Most of you have strategic plans in place that you've been executing successfully against, and making sure, again, that you factor in this economic impact we've seen from COVID-19 and possible recession, but also thinking about how you leverage your assets in the best manner. You don't want to be all things to all people, and leveraging your assets with your existing businesses and to attract new ones is really important. Next slide, please. So as you think about incentives and what's going to be important, especially again in this post-COVID-19 world that we're moving forward in, first of all, incentives that offset project and or operating costs will continue to be important for companies. That will not shift. Certainly, there may be a little bit more emphasis placed on incentives that can help offset project costs, because that helps with upfront capital, and just like governmental entities will see some impact, clearly businesses are going to see some impact from a financial standpoint as well. Accountability and transparency for incentive programs will continue to be very important. In some ways, maybe more important than we've seen in the past, given the economic environment we're in. Obviously that's a challenge for professional economic development people, for site selectors and others, as you are going through a process to really educate elected officials, the community as a whole, to understand that there are accountability standards in place, and to have that process be as transparent as possible without creating a situation where confidentiality is breached, through that process. Another really important thing, and we're starting to see some of this with some of our clients really as they look at for calendar year 2020 and what those implications may be, the potential to renegotiate some existing public-private partnerships that are in place related to incentives because of the current economic conditions. And that's not to say that a client is trying to walk away from commitments, especially in a situation where maybe they received some upfront funds, but rather saying, okay, here's what we need to do. Perhaps it's extending the timeline. If it was a 3-year window to hit your job and capital investment goals, maybe we extend that by a year or two to factor in this environment. It's not to suggest that there's a lack of confidence in their ability to be successful, but rather this has been something that this was something no one predicted, and it will have an impact as we look out over the next year or so. And then finally, that open and honest feedback throughout the incentive negotiation process. We have found it to be critically important for a long time, but it's going to be even more important now. It's important for economic development groups, governmental entities, site selectors, and their clients to be able to talk through in a very open environment. Here are the key issues impacting the project. Here are the economics required to make the project work, and here are ways we can co-invest together to not only allow the project to move forward, but to benefit the community, region, and state where we're located. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, I'll just touch on key takeaways before I hand it back to Rick. So as you think about what we've discussed here today and what I've talked about specifically related to incentives, the locations, as always, that are best prepared to move forward quickly and competently will be best positioned for success, both in the short term as we come out of COVID-19, about long-term success as we look at our economies going forward. Secondly, the economic development professionals and governmental officials will continue to need to strongly advocate the importance of investing in key areas that support economic development, essentially those key underpinnings, things like job training, infrastructure, access to capital, and other strategic areas that are important to your community. Maybe it's quality of place, other things that are talent attraction tools. It'll be really important to know that that pressure will be coming to cut funding, but it's important to keep those things in place to help you stabilize and grow your economies again. As I mentioned earlier, don't try to be all things to all people. Focus on your existing businesses and your leverageable assets to drive future economic growth, while still at the same time looking how you attract new companies to your area to help you round out your economy. And then finally, bold and aggressive leadership is needed more than ever. As we've seen and gone through this process, leadership is always important, but when you go through a crisis, it's more under a microscope, and that bold and aggressive leadership will serve communities, regions, and states well as we move forward. So with that, I'll hand it back to our fearless leader, Rick Weddle, to lead us through the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, Greg, Dee Dee, Jay. Wow, a little bit like drinking from a fire hydrant. What a lot of content that we covered there. This is going to turn into a Q&A that's going to be a little bit like a lightning round. So I'm going to move real quickly and we'll run through it as fast as we can. Dee Dee, let's start with you. You covered site visits in your presentation. What about site location activity? Just how many companies do you see actually being in the field doing site visits this summer?
Well, I did a impromptu poll of the Site Selectors Guild. It wasn't anything official. I just sent a message out through Basecamp a few weeks ago because I was curious about what other people were doing. And I asked two questions. I asked how many consultants had projects that were going to be doing site visits between now and the end of summer, and when did they expect those projects to announce? And I got responses from almost a dozen folks. And together there were about 20 projects, at least 20 projects that were going to be in the field this summer. And the vast majority of them, the consultants expected those decisions to be made by the end of the year. And there were a few that said that it would probably be first quarter of 2021. So it seems like the pace of projects and the project activity, if it has slowed at all, it really has not slowed that much. I have heard from people that they did have to delay getting out into the field right when everything shut down, which that was understandable. But I'm starting to see more and more projects get out there and start doing the site visits as we get closer to summer.
Great, thank you, Dee Dee. Jay, what about workforce? Before the pandemic, we were at full employment. Does the current environment mean that workforce or talent's no longer so important?
It's not going to go away. We are in a obviously a short-term situation as it relates to the workforce supply. A number of experts think that the labor force participation rate will go from 62%, where we are now, to 70%. Remember, labor force participation includes not only those that are working, but those who are looking for work. And because we have so many who are now out of work, Depression era unemployment rates, we have a number of baby boomers who have challenges with their pensions or 401ks. It's going to swell the labor force participation rate once again. There's still, as I said earlier, there's still going to be a skills shortage. And we've got to make sure that communities are focusing on skill development based on what their targeted industries are or the clusters that are in their respective regions.
Interesting, good point. Greg, you touched on a lot of things in your opportunities, but if reliability and predictability are now more important in supply chains, how is this impacting competitive position of states and regions? Will there be new groups of winners and losers?
Rick, that's a good question. I think there's a new element that is entering the business climate indices, and that is, the stay-at-home orders. And we only have to look at how, Michigan and New Jersey were handled and compare that to, say, for example, Georgia and Alabama. And you have two sort of very different strategies. And that'll have a big impact on business climate. So I think with respect to that element of site searches, I think there's going to be some big changes.
Interesting. Let me come back to Dee Dee real quickly. You talked about in your virtual site visits, 2 to 4 hour chunk of time. Was that for one site or was that a group of sites? Was that, is there a rule of thumb in that?
It's typically for one site. It's in some cases we're looking at more than one site in a community. I mean, keeping in mind what type of project it is. So the types of projects I normally work are, big heavy industrial projects that need a very robust big site with very robust services and utilities. So typically we're looking at one. But if you're looking for something that's a little bit less robust from either a size or utility or a logistics infrastructure standpoint, then you could potentially cover more than one site in a community in that time period.
Quick question for any of the panelists that came through. Is there any thoughts on how EDOs should be communicating with you in this environment today? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take that because we spend, we track our hours and we spend about, between our small little team, all of the people, we probably spend about 10 man weeks here meeting with economic developers in a normal environment. And that includes both, hosting them in our office and also going on familiarization tours and things like that. And we feel like that is all of that is unpaid, and we feel like that's an investment in our ability to represent those communities to our clients. So we're a little bit handicapped because we can't go on fam tours and economic developers really can't come see us in our offices right now. So we've been doing a number of kind of, touch base, particularly with regional, state, or large utilities, because we obviously don't have time to do it with every community. But we've been doing some of that. I'm doing something really interesting with Tucson, I think in a week or so, where they're shipping tamales to the team, and we're going to have a lunch. They bribed us with handmade tamales. I mean, who wouldn't say yes to that? So I think that communities are getting really creative on ways to stay in contact with site selection consultants.
Anyone else want to take a cut at or get in on the tamales?
Yeah, we'll get in on the tamales. Hey, Rick, so what we're doing is we're actually, every week, our team chats on Thursday mornings. And what we've been doing is we've been inviting states and large EDOs to join our meetings for a half hour. And we just chat about what's going on. What are they seeing in the field, and vice versa. They want to know, what we're seeing with our clients. And so it's an opportunity, at least, a couple times a month for us to chat with and to stay connected with the EDOs.
Question on competitiveness, not from individual locations, but looking at the U.S. as a whole. I'm going to ask this question as best I can interpret. It says, beyond reshoring, is FDI within the U.S. growing or shrinking, given our numbers of COVID-19 outbreak, and our foreign companies maintaining confidence in the U.S.? That's a tough one, but let's open it up for the panel.
Globalization as a whole within the U.S., based on tariffs being used as a negotiation tactic, and just strategy used by the administration, globalization as a whole is shrinking. And then at the same time, what you're seeing now, and Greg pointed to this, the country of Japan set aside $8 billion to incentivize Japanese companies that have a presence in China to move to Japan. And then our administration is talking about setting aside $35 billion to do the same. So again, to shore up the supply chain. So I think that you're going to still see, for a number of reasons, primarily related to risk mitigation and other related to job enhancement, because we are going to need job creation now, that you'll see less of that globalization. I will point out, I had a stat here that I think is just absolutely fascinating and I think very true. Colliers is saying that to push for supply chain resilience, just in the U.S. alone, there's going to be a need for between 750 million and 1 billion square feet of industrial space. And that makes our EDO partners know that if they have product, they'll see a project. And for our guild members, that should mean probably a lot of activity.
Very
Rick,
interesting.
I have another stat that I'd like to throw out there that shows how much confidence there is in the U.S. economy. This was, I guess, about a week ago. The U.S. Treasury floated 20-year bonds for the first time since 1986, and they had absolutely no trouble finding investors to purchase those bonds at a whopping yield of 1.22%. 20-year bonds at 1.22%. That shows that global investors would rather invest their money in the U.S. at a return of 1.22% a year rather than risk it in some other currency or some other venture outside of the U.S. I think that speaks volumes.
So don't give up on us yet. Looks like we still have some opportunities. I'm not sure whether we lost Larry or not, but if he's still online, I'll give him this question. But if not, I'll take it from anyone who can answer it. You know, with so many state and local budgets being really disrupted by this COVID-19 lockdown and the other things going on, it seems like the politics of incentive negotiation might be shifting a little bit. How does a company go about negotiating the best deal without looking too opportunistic in this budget constrained time? Anyone want to take a run at that one?
Well, you know, we are seeing a shift to, and I think that my colleagues on the line would probably agree with this, that there's more and more of the shift to performance-based incentives as opposed to incentives that are paid up front. And philosophically, at our company, we support those types of incentives because it really is about a partnership. And, you know, our purpose at GLS is to match companies and communities for long-term mutual success. And that's both economic success, but also environmental stewardship and social harmony. So we are really in tune with that. And I think instead of focusing on incentives, that companies and communities need to think about what is the best match for them on all fronts. And then the incentive should be a complement to that. And so I think if companies go in with that frame of mind, then they're going to have a much warmer reception when it comes to how the community is going to perceive them.
And Rick, to that point, you know, for long-term projects, you know, the community has to be stable long-term in order to support the company. And so what we do is we run a very simple discounted cash flow model to make sure that there's enough of a return in tax revenues to the states and local communities that they can support our companies long-term. That's critically important. So almost all of our clients, like DD's, are generational type of investment decisions. You know, we have very few folks who are only looking at 3 to 4 years. You know, their time frame, probably the shortest time frame we're seeing right now, is a decade.
Interesting. This question probably answers itself, but I'm going to go ahead and share it with you from one of our audiences. That perhaps it's too soon to ask, but how have the riots or the protests or the disruptions in our urban environment had an impact on site selection parameters or the response? Anything?
You know, we're not seeing anything yet. I mean, it's just too soon. It's been happening, for all of 10 days. But, you know, I think what we need to watch for in the long term, when we combine the sort of pandemic hotspots that we've seen in urban areas, along with some of the unrest that's happened in some of the urban cores, think something we need to keep on our radar screen is what happens with the demographic shift. Do we still see millennials moving to large urban cores, or is there now a sort of a spreading out of the millennials, especially with these remote working relationships? You know, do they have the ability to work remotely and not necessarily in a large high rise?
Mm-hmm.
That leads right into what it looks like will probably be our last question, but it says, should communities in low areas of population density or low pandemic or COVID-19 transmission, should they market themselves as safe or lower risk communities? I thought that was an interesting question from one of our audience.
Yeah, why not? I mean, the reality of if they can prove to the fact that they have less incidences of COVID, if they are stronger in terms of public safety, use all of the tools in your toolbox for your marketing efforts.
You know, resiliency was a big word, you know, post Katrina, and we kind of forgot about it. And, you know, I did a global business continuity risk assessment for one of my clients in 16 of their 17 manufacturing facilities around the world. And I mean, we list every risk that you could possibly think of, but this took place somewhere between like 2012 and 2015 or so. And not one of us talked about pandemic at all. And I think that's definitely changed. But going back to that resiliency, like Jay said, public safety, you know, it's a combination of, you know, natural disasters, utilities, logistics, social unrest. I mean, all of these things have to factor into the location decision. And if you have a supply chain that is only chasing the lowest cost of production without also considering the risk associated with every link in that supply chain, then you're not accurately pricing the inputs of that product.
Well, thank you, panel. That's really all the time we have today. We could go on and on all afternoon with this conversation, but I'm going to turn it back to Jay Garner and let you wrap it up, Jay.
All right, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dee Dee, Greg, Larry. You all did a magnificent job on presenting some great thought leadership as it relates to our economic development partners. So thank you all for your participation. To the economic development pros that are on this webinar, we thank you for your involvement, your support of the Guild. We know, again, that you're on the front lines, and we wish you Godspeed in moving forward as we navigate these really challenging times. Thank you all. Stay tuned. You'll hear more from us in the foreseeable and short future. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.